a podcast called Strangest Fruit.
Ready, Chief?
I'm ready as I'll ever be.
Let's dance.
Just be nice to me.
I feel like Maverick. All right, how's everybody doing on this wonderful, wonderful day in sunny Southern California? Let's not take note to the guy who said he didn't like LA earlier. So, now we have a note, and this is probably one of the biggest interviews of my career. This is, probably for the whole city of Los Angeles County, especially from the people in the certain areas, Watts, Compton, Los Angeles County, South Central, wherever places they may be at, because this is the first time that, I'll say from my area of being formerly incarcerated, tried as an adult, as well as the first podcast of this kind to actually sit down with a major city official who came into LA like, I came for the change, and as the youngsters say now, you came to stand on business and you said, I want all the smoke. And that's highly, highly appreciative, because without you, a lot of stuff, a lot of laws, a lot of rules, a lot of manipulation of the law from my perspective and from a lot of people nationwide, it would not be where it is now. So first off, I would like to thank you.
Pleasure, thank you.
And a lot of men and women sitting in prison right now, if they had the chance, if they could, they would be doing the same thing and saying, thank you for what you're doing for our city.
I appreciate that, and thank you for doing this work.
Yeah, so tell us about Gascón in a sense of outside of all the crazy chaos that everybody wants you to be responsible of. Who are you as a person? Yeah,
I mean, look, I grew up in a very poor immigrant household, Southeast LA. Place named Cudahy. Very few people know that place. A very little city, southeast part of the county. I was a monolingual Spanish speaker. I was doing very poor in school. I was often hanging around with the wrong crowd. I dropped out of school, dropped out of high school. I joined the Army, and that was my salvation, if you will. And that's where I finished my high school education. Then I came out of the Army, went to college, and then I became an LAPD officer. And I was a police officer for, almost a little over 30 years between LAPD, and then I was chief of police in Mesa, Arizona, and in San Francisco. And, I used to joke around that, when I was a young kid before I went in the Army, we would run away from the sheriff.
Right.
And then later on, I was the one that was chasing some kids around the neighborhood, right? But I have my own personal evolution as I grew through the ranks. I went to law school, I became an attorney, and the more that I mature professionally, and the more work that I did not only locally, but I started doing national work and international work, I recognize increasingly that the model of public safety that we use in this country was not necessarily achieving public safety, right? And, there were several moments in my own evolution that kind of created a sort of wake-up calls, if you will. One of them was the incident involving the beating of Rodney King, and then the civil unrest that followed. And I often tell people, when I was a police officer at the time, was a sergeant, I used to call it a riot. Right. And today I call it a civil unrest. And the reason for that is because today, and when I say today, I mean in the last 2 decades, I recognize that so much of what went on there was the anger and the impact that a very oppressive system, both in policing, education, and public health and housing, was having in communities of color, in this case around the Watts area, which is where I work. And while it is true that there were some people that were rioting and, burning buildings and all that stuff, there were a lot of people that were just simply fed up with the conditions that they were living in and how much the system kept them down. And the police play a role in that. Not the only role, but they play an important role. And I started to think differently about my work and where, what would that work look like? And, a lot of people don't understand. Like, I'm not an abolitionist. I believe that we have to have good policing. I personally spent most of my adult life in public safety. But to me, good policing is a very broad term, right? It's a term that includes bringing community together. It includes actually working with the community, getting community permission to police in a way that it fits that community at the same time that you're protecting them.
That is a very, very interesting statement and belief system right there. I believe it was about 3 weeks ago we were at a city council meeting in Compton with the Game Changer event, and we were looking at the footage that they had to where there was an officer speaking, the CHP, LAPD, different people of the community, and one of the things that the officer said was, no matter what I tell you to do, you do what I tell you to do. And it was such an uproar within the place that it was like, did he really just say that? And how comfortable and how normalized is it for you to live this way or conduct yourself this way to actually believe that? When you say you have to go to the people and ask for permission, there needs to be a communication, basically.
Yeah. Look, I think that we often harm not only the relationship, but I think we often harm young police officers in the way that we train them, right? When I was trained, it was always the concept that you needed to have the upper hand, that you always had to be, sort of the baddest, if you will, in a scenario. And there's no question, sometimes you got to take control of the situation, right?
Absolutely.
I don't want to minimize that. And there are times when, police is going to have to use force, including deadly force, to protect themselves and to protect others. And that is okay. But generally speaking, police makes thousands of contacts every single day in our community. And most of those contacts are for very minor things. It's either the person is reporting a crime, they witnessed a crime, or maybe it was a traffic stop for a minor traffic violation. And I think in those interactions, which is really what generally defines the community, the interaction between police and the community, is where you have, I believe, an obligation to ensure that there is almost a joint governance approach to it, meaning the community and the police are meeting regularly, not necessarily during that incident, but in preparation for that traffic stop or the thing, and how, what are the rules of engagement? How are we going to enforce this, smaller statutes that need to be enforced, but you do it in a way that makes sense for the community. Where are you going to let people go away with a warning as opposed to a citation, or go away with a warning as opposed to an arrest, or a citation as opposed to an arrest? And generally police does really well in affluent communities doing that, right? So the question for me is, it's almost an issue of equal protection under the law, right? You should treat people in poor communities the same way that you would treat people in more affluent communities, and be culturally sensitive to the work that you're doing. And I think when you do that, not only is the community going to be safer it's going to be safer for the officers. And I think that then you gain the willing compliance of people, that then they accept the intrusions, if you will, of the law, because they understand it's for the greater good, right? Because now certainly the cops they are part of us, as opposed to being an occupation army.
Right. And that's interesting, because it's not even interesting, it's just cold fact. Because me being a person who was incarcerated and having 7 sisters, and there's nobody there to protect them while I'm in prison. If a situation occurs and they come to me and they ask, well, who do I go to? And I tell them, you have to call the police.
Right, yeah.
I can't do anything for you. There's certain things that, as a man or as a role model in the figure of the family, that you do, and there's certain things that you have to have a higher power be involved with, and that's where that's at. Somebody gets their store robbed, you can't call me, I can't help you. You have to call the police. Things happen at a schoolhouse, you have to call the police. And I have to ask myself when it comes to policing, and I had to learn this from being incarcerated. I had to sit down and take accountability for what I did, but also say, hey, do I have the ability to put myself in someone else's shoes? And those shoes being the shoes of an officer. I make a moral inventory of that, and I asked myself, and I came to the conclusion, and it's a fact, and I will openly admit it, I cannot be a cop. Yeah. And people are like, well, that's right, I know a lot of people can't be a cop. No, I can't be a cop because I don't have the willpower to say, hey, or have the quick thinking to say, I don't know if this guy has a gun or not. I don't know whether he's going to do this. I don't know whether he's going to harm me or anything. And for those reasons, I know to eliminate myself from that because you're held to a higher caliber. You were held to, now you're at the highest of it. So what you're telling me makes perfect sense. But to the masses, when you had so many fingers pointed at you, what is your angle of communication with those groups who just say, hey, no, what you're doing is wrong. How do you combat that? Yeah,
I mean, look, interestingly enough, the way that you express your feelings actually are very common in the black and the brown community. You know, people in the community want to have the police there. They need the police. They know that when there is someone that wants to harm them, the people they want to go to is the police. They just want a police that is respectful, that is thoughtful. So I think often people think that, for instance, people in the black community don't like the police, and I found that to be actually the contrary. And I worked in Watts for many years, so I'm not speaking through a theoretical lens. I was there. I was a sergeant. I was a lieutenant. I was a captain. So I know what people are expecting, and I think that people, will support the police when they feel that the police is there to protect them in a respectful manner. I used to tell cops all the time, usually the way you fund police stations is you have what is called a bond fund. You go to the voters, you ask for money through a bond, which is basically a loan that the government takes in order to do a government project. And for police stations, generally, that's the way that it works. And invariably, in my experience, when you have this election citywide, in any city, by the way, the black community will overwhelmingly support a bond fund to build a new police station or to build a better police facility, unlike sometimes, quite frankly, more conservative communities that have a different experience with the police, but they actually don't want to spend the money, right? So the concept that somehow the African American community, the brown community, are anti-police is a myth. People want to be respected. Right. People want to have a say in how their government works. So to your point, I think that this is where, good, thoughtful, mature police officers can go in the community, they can be respectful, and that guy with a gun, they do what they have to do.
Correct.
And when they have to take action, the majority of the community understands it, and they're going to support him, especially if he or she is someone that has been working in that community, and people have a history, and that history is one of mutual respect. I was a young officer, actually take it back, I was not a young officer, I was a young sergeant working in Newton Division. And, LAPD sergeants work by themselves. I have been an officer for many years, where you have a partner, also going to working by myself, so I'm not used to working by myself.
Momentarily, can you describe, place us, what year and what's going on in Watts, Compton, California in that year and time? It's a drastic change of what it is now. Compton was considered then Chopper City, had the largest amount of AK-47s murders going on in that city. How did you make it out of that as a high-ranking officer and make your way up to be one of the most respected and trusted? How did you do that, as well as with the community?
Yeah, so look, I'm talking now, this incident that I'm going to describe to you, I'm talking is about 1988. Working in Newton Division, about a 10 square mile area, just in Newton Division, around had about 80 homicides a year.
That was the peak of the Blood and Crip Wars.
We had 1,000 homicides a year in the city in those areas, right? Nothing compared to today. And I remember, one day there was a gentleman that was at a corner in Central Avenue, I think it was about 35th Street, 36, I can't remember where, And he's acting up, and he's swinging a stick, and he's threatening people. And I'm coming by myself, I'm in the marked police cart, and I stop. I call for help, but help takes a while to get there, and I go out to try to intervene, right? And pretty soon things got pretty ugly, right? Where it was, I was really very close to having to shoot this individual, right? And we didn't have a taser at that moment. I didn't have any of those tools with me at that moment. And there were people in the community that recognized me because I've been already working there for a while, and it was some of those people that actually came in and helped me talk this person down, and then he was taken into custody. He was going through a mental health episode. But very easily, and by the way, it would have been lawful because it came closely dangerous to me, I could have shot him. And if it weren't for the assistance of the members of the community that were there at the time, I probably would have had to in order to protect myself and protect others. So my point is, and this was like, at the height of the tension, right? Where people were upset at the police and all that stuff. So even during those years, people will recognize when they're being treated with respect and, and act accordingly, right? So, my point to all this is that I think that policing is necessary in every community, but it's certainly very necessary in communities that are very vulnerable, right? They go through a lot of other challenges. And the question is not to police or not to police. The question is, how do you police, how much policing you have, and then what are the resources you bring into bear, right? That gentleman that was having a mental episode, that would have been nice if instead of me with a gun, would have been, somebody that has a public health training. Now, clearly, they're not going to be out there patrolling, so I understand all of that. But the point is, there are other ways to do the work. And then, frankly, that leads to the next part of my question. In my own personal evolution professionally, I came to the conclusion that we incarcerate way too many people, and that doesn't necessarily, that doesn't equate to more safety in our community. Yes, some people are dangerous. Yes, some people need to be incarcerated and held accountable because they're harmful at the time. But the question is, when do you incarcerate people? How long do you incarcerate people for? And what is behind that process to make sure that when people come out,
right,
they're going to come out a better person than the one winning?
A big question I've wanted to ask for years is, what made you say, just because it had to be something that clicked, to say, all right, enough is enough with the juvenile over sentencing? What made you say the kids, because I survived CYA, I survived juvenile halls, and went to prison straight at the age of 8. For my 18th birthday, that was my gift, to be transferred to a maximum security prison. What made you just say, you know what, I may be this one person against everybody on this, along with Elizabeth Calvin, of course.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But this is what I'm gonna be about, and this is the first thing that I'm gonna, what made, that is a very, very big move.
Yeah. Look, there were multiple things. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, I started doing work internationally, so I got to see other systems. I got to see how European nations deal with juvenile offenders, and it's very, very different to the way that we deal with them, right? There is a presumption that the brain development science is going to be the guiding force when you're dealing with juveniles. Today, we know also, and when I say today, I don't mean just today, we've known for a couple of decades at least, that the human brain doesn't develop fully until we're somewhere in our mid-20s. Jokingly, I said, actually, for the guys, it's like the mid-50s, right? The women mature much, much earlier. But joking aside, so if you understand that we're all a product of our environment, right? And when your brain is not fully developed, you tend to be a risk taker, right? So I tell people, look, if you were born in a family that had scuba divers, a 14, 15-year-old, not only you want to be a scuba diver, but you want to be a real badass scuba diver, right? You want to do what nobody else is doing because you think you're invincible. If you grow up in a community where there are gangs and there are shootings and people are being killed, and you might have even grown up in a very violent home, right? Maybe your parents were fighting, your mother was the victim of domestic violence, right? You sort of have been almost immunized from violence in some ways, right? So as a young person, just like this young kid in another setting may go out scuba diving and do crazy stuff scuba diving, you're going to do crazy stuff in this other environment, right, where there's a lot of violence. So if you understand that, and you understand that if you actually try to provide off-ramps for young people so they mature out of crime with the right level of intervention and support and education, that actually they can come out at that other end and be not only a more productive human being for the entire community, but actually create more safety in the community, then you begin to question whether putting an 18-year-old or certainly putting a 15, 16-year-old in an adult prison, which we did all the time, right? So for me, it was, sort of that my own personal growth intellectually and maturing. I mean, listen, when I was a young cop, I used to say, you do adult crime, you pay adult price, right? But I was ignorant. I did not have the level of knowledge that we have today. So I think it's how do we evolve, right? As a community, how do we get to a place that actually creates more safety? And when you look at the way that European countries, like, the Scandinavian countries or Germany, how they deal with juvenile offenders, they deal with them very differently, and they don't have many of the problems that we have. And I hear people, by the way, I used to hear people say, well, these are countries that are very homogenic. Like, implication was, well, these are all white middle-class places. Well, no, they're not, right? If you go to Berlin today, and by the way, today, 10 years ago, Berlin is black. Berlin is Muslim. Berlin is white. Berlin is gay. Is Latino. I mean, you walk any street in Berlin, you could be walking in New York City or LA, the more densely part of our city, other than if you look at the street signs and the language. So my point is, this has nothing to do with the demographic makeup of a community. It has to do with the way the system works.
That's correct. I was at a shop, and I walked in, and the owner, he was like, I said, hey, have you heard about the things? What is your perception of Compton, or what is your perception of LA? What is your perception of these different places outside of where you're at? And the first thing that came out of this guy's mouth was, well, if Gascon would do this and do that, and I laughed. He said, well, if he locked them all up, and I grabbed my money and I slid it back across the table. And I looked at him and I said, Gascon is one of the reasons why I'm here, and the reason why my brother is here, and the reason why so many people are out. Gascon is the reason why there's a juvenile going to college right now for his master's, and he's a dog trainer because certain things were implemented and we're able to do this. I said, but at the end of it, did you go and vote? He said, yes. Did you read exactly what you voted for? You can't be upset over something that you voted for if these were things that are already implemented by the state and the city of Los Angeles County. But what you can do is look more insightful and not be just one-sided and be open-minded to learning different things. Because if you want to judge a person off the crimes that they did at the age of 14, it was one of our team members were talking, they said, if Malcolm X would have died at 21, he would have died as a drug addict, a pimp, and some type of gambler. Then they said if another person would have died, it said she would have died as a prostitute and as a woman with multiple kids out of wedlock. But being that these people live and they were given a chance at life, you get to see these beautiful flowers blossom out of the concrete. So if we're not going to give people the chances, then who are we? Are we cavemen? Are we medieval? Are we moving backward and not moving forward?
Yeah, and this is where, there's two components to this, right? Just because you're giving people chances doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable. You can hold them accountable, but people, they should be, I heard this, and these are not my words, and I don't know who to attribute them, but I want to make sure that I don't take credit for them. But our system works on the presumption of innocence, right? Which is important. But I heard someone say, wouldn't we be a better place if we work also under the presumption of redemption, the presumption of forgiveness? I think we would be a much better world, right? Certainly we would be a much better community. And again, people that want to politicize this will often say, well, it's soft on crime, or no, we're not going to let them go, right? They're going to be held accountable. The question is, what does accountability looks like, for how long, and what do you want as an end product of that, right? If your penal system is about punishment, you're going to have less success than if your penal system is about rehabilitation.
Right.
You know, bringing people back, bringing people whole, right? You know, that gentleman that you were buying a product, you know, I would have told him also, you know, by the way, the reason why I'm able to buy something and patronize your business is because I was given a second chance.
Right.
Right? You know,
Okay, that's he said get to patronize your business.
making you a taxpayer.
Right.
Instead of it somebody that's taking money from the government, you're now a taxpayer.
Right. So this is I need to ask your honest opinion. And for the people who are watching this, get an understanding of what he just did. He just gave you, here goes a problem, here goes a resolution. What we tend to live in is these are the problems, we don't know any resolution, and we don't want to deal with the resolution. We don't even want to come and involve it. It basically becomes, I'll say it, I no longer accept pity when I know there's a way to change something. Because that just, my profession that I learned in prison is a dog trainer. So I learned the perception of make it real simple. Dogs live in the moment. You leave out of here, you come back, the dog will be like, oh my God, no, I don't realize anything that happened with that. I'm just happy to see you, let me lick all over you.
Yep.
Oh, you got a treat? Oh, that moment's gone now. Now I'm happy about the treat.
Yeah, that's right.
And with certain dogs, it takes a different intensity level to correct them. Me, myself, it took me 18 years of correction. Did I commit the crime? I committed every single crime that I did. I did it. I accepted, I went and did the whole process. It's my turn to rehabilitate and learn. So I learned the proper ways inside. I got that down. No matter whatever the circumstance or whatever prison I was in, I put myself there. I take accountability for that. One of the biggest things and the hardest things for a person to do is to accept or conform to being wrongfully convicted.
Yeah.
And we have a big problem with that in this nation.
We do.
What is your aspect on that, and how do we move forward with correcting these issues?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's one of the one of the areas that we put a lot of attention in this office. You know, we have now exonerated 14 individuals. And when you look at each of those, and by the way, we're working on about 100 cases. And if you listen to the Innocence Project in LA County alone, there may be as many as, well, I'm sorry, in the state of California, there may be as many as 5,000 men and women in prison that are factually innocent. But, you know, let's take our example, you know. Every one of the cases that we have exonerated, when you start looking sort of deeply into the case, and by the way, we don't just do this. I mean, we reinvestigate the case. We go through a great deal of work to make sure that the person that we're seeking to exonerate, in fact, is factually innocent. This is not, you know, a given. But we find that there were major system failures, right? There was evidence that was ignored. There was shoddy police work, shoddy prosecution work, bad direction from a judge. I mean, generally, one or many of those are all coming together, and you end up with a wrongful conviction. But what I notice in most of these cases so far that we've seen is there is an the overlay of racism, right? And which impacts the system, right? It's that bias, whether it's implicit or explicit, you know, you see it over and over again, right? Black kid did something, you have somebody that probably didn't see who that person was, even cross-racially connected witness that we know that generally we have a hard time recognizing people of another race, and we take their word for it, even though that if you took a little bit of time and say, is it possible that you saw what you saw from where you were? Could you have seen what you say you saw? Right? You know, what else is on board? But we go with it because we have this presumption that if it's a black kid or a brown kid, they must have done what they were accused of. Yeah, maybe they had some bad history, maybe they didn't. We find, you know, some people actually had no bad history, others did, but they were not necessarily, they didn't commit the crime that they went to prison for. So, you know, for me, this is an area that cries for attention at the state, at the national level. It should not be up to a local prosecutor. I mean, we do it, and we're doing it case by case. But I think there ought to be, quite frankly, more of certainly in our state, statewide recognition that if in fact, look, even if the Innocence Project is only 20% right, let's say that it's not 5,000, there's 1,000. That's a lot of people that are in prison that are innocent, number one. Number two, it also tells you that it's a system that breaks down often enough to put other innocent people in prison, right? So I think that, we have an obligation both legislatively and collectively to come up with solutions. Number one, to make sure that if there are people that are in prison innocent, that they get released, and it should not be up to the local prosecutor, because let's say that I'm out of office tomorrow, some other guy could come in and say, well, I'm going to do what the other people did before him, which was ignore it, right? It should be more a systemic approach to exonerations retroactively, and a systemic approach to avoiding future wrongful convictions.
With such cases, like, example, Frankie Carrillo. Everybody knows who Frankie is. Yeah. Just extreme miscarriage of justice. Yeah. I mean, all the way to if you've seen the document, I'm pretty sure you did, is to have an officer get on the stand and openly admit that, hey, I'm a Linwood Viking and this is what we do and this was messed up. And like, how do you explain to a person who's wrongfully convicted from your perspective to have them get an understanding of saying, I know this is what you're up against. Don't stop fighting when they've been sitting in prison for 15 years and it's been a 5-year wait to at least get it back. And from a person sitting in prison, it only takes 5 seconds for you to lose your life. Yeah.
Look, first of all, I want to be humble enough to say that I don't know what it's like being in prison.
Right.
Right. I can only, sort of think about it through discussions that I've had with others. So I don't want anybody to assume that here is this guy in a suit and tie telling, how to survive in prison, because that would be extremely irresponsible and, quite frankly, just not the right thing, right?
I mean, of course.
But here's what I think. Okay, now I'm talking as a human being, not as a DA. I think, historically, when we stand strong in our convictions and we fight and we don't give up, there is a greater likelihood that eventually you will succeed. So my advice as a human being would be, look, I understand that you feel that the system wronged you, and it did if you were innocent. And I understand that the system continues to harm you by not acknowledging what occurred. But there's also light at the tunnel, and that light at the tunnel only comes for the one that did not give up, right? You got to keep fighting. And I'm going to give you an example, because I think that will speak to many men and women that may be situated in this way. And by the way, Frankie and I are personal friends, so I'm going to jump to somebody that I have no relationship with other than we exonerated him, okay? There's a gentleman by the name of Maurice Hastings. Okay, Maurice Hastings is an African-American man that did approximately 37 years in prison.
I know Mr. Hastings.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Hastings was accused and convicted of murder and rape. This office, LA County DA, actually tried to get Mr. Hastings to be executed. They thought the death penalty twice. Fortunately, and by the way, when they did, that was a time when people could have been executed. Fortunately, the jury agreed to the conviction, but not to the penalty phase. So he wound up going to prison. He was going to be in prison for the rest of his life. Mr. Hastings always maintained his innocence from the beginning all the way through his release. In fact, he was not paroled because when he was going from the parole board, he refused to admit responsibility because he said, I didn't do it, right? Therefore, I'm not going to admit to something that I didn't. And Mr. Hastings was sort of a model prisoner, so he could have been released by then, but he needed to admit to something, and he said, I didn't do it, so I'm not going to do it. I'll stay in prison. But here's where it really gets ugly, and this is why I like to give people hope, right? Mr. Hastings actually started to educate himself in the last 20 years of his 37 years in prison. He started to educate himself about, how to seek the habeas, how to try to get his case heard, and he finally found people that wanted to represent him. And he asked this office, 2 prior administrations back to back, he said, please test the DNA kit from the rape kit in this case, because if you do, you're going to find out that I was not the person that committed the rape. And by this time, DNA was advanced enough that we could have done it, 20 years ago. And this office, twice, under 2 administrations, told them that rape kit was not available. In fact, they told him it was destroyed. And then when I came into office, what he did, Mr. Hastings, talking about persistence, he did it with one DA. That DA went away, he did it with the next. That DA went away, then I come in, he did it with the next, right? He did not give up. Had Mr. Hastings given up, he would still be in prison today.
Correct.
Right? But he sent it, and interestingly enough, members of my staff at the time, and they're no longer my staff, they said, your job, our job, is to protect the integrity of their conviction. And I said, well, bingo, so we're out for the facts. They said, no, protect the conviction. And I said, but wait a minute, isn't our job to seek the truth, right?
Semantics.
Seek the truth. So make a long story short, and I don't want to get all the details because it takes a while, but we went out, I gave direction, let's try to see if the DNA kit's available, the rape kit, and we found that the Inglewood Police Department had it in their evidence refrigerator. And that kit was tested, and lo and behold, it came back to another man who went out to rape another woman after Mr. Hastings, because that's the problem with a wrongful conviction. Not only you're causing harm to one person, but you cause harm to the entire community, because the person that did the harm continues to be out there with the capacity to harm others. In this case, another woman unnecessarily was raped because this guy was allowed to continue to go around freely. He eventually died in prison out of some medical conditions. But my point is, Mr. Hastings is now a free man, and he would not be a free man but for his faith and his persistence in keep pushing and pushing and pushing until he got out. Now, arguably, many would say, well, he should have been out 20 years ago. Well, he should have been out 7 years ago, right? He should have never gone into prison. But to those that are out there and are thinking about giving up, just think about Mr. Hastings. Don't give up.
Because that's one of the things I talked to the 2 men about. All this, this isn't my thing, Mr. Gascon. I'm a simple man who wants to train dogs, and I love my city of Compton. I take pride in my citizens and everybody that's there.
You should.
And 2 names came across, and it was our producer, Ray. He was like, hey, it's these guys. I'm not college educated on law, but if I can read cases, and within those cases, to the plain eye, it doesn't make sense and nothing adds up, I'm like, man, it's something that it irks at you, it reaches out. It's like, you need to do something. There's something here. So I take it and I give it to a person that has nothing. I go way to, Wilmington, Whittier somewhere. Hey, to a school teacher, read this. Do these cases make sense? Take your time. I don't care if it takes you a year. They say, yeah, this is something about this. It's just plain right here in my face. And I was like, well, all right, let's start the fight for Gascon.
Yeah.
About this.
Yeah. And like I said, we're looking at over 100 cases right now, and they keep coming. And, we, unfortunately, and this is the reason why I said earlier, it should not be up to a local prosecutor, because really the state needs to put the resources available to make sure that these cases are investigated and that we move through them expeditiously. And it should not be up to the local resources, or certainly should not be up to just the prosecutor, right? Because as I said, Mr. Hastings again, and I go back to him, but there are 14 others now. These are people that were sitting there in prior administrations were refusing to look at it. And I'm sure there are many other county district attorneys that would do the same thing that was being done here before.
Well, this was very impactful. It was very educational. I learned a lot. I mean, a lot of stuff I wouldn't did homework before. The world needs to catch up on Mr. Gascon. I've been studying. Yeah. But what does the community need to do in order to get certain laws or whatever rules, whatever it is, implemented? Because a lot of us don't know. Like, I didn't even know about voting things until I got out because it's not seen. I
mean, look, first of all, let me begin by saying that I understand it's not easy, right? Getting involved, being informed, participating in the political process, for people that are working every day, just trying to, pay the rent and put food on the table, it's not an easy thing to do. But here's the thing that I like people to think. about it. When you do not engage the process, when you are not informed, when you vote or even don't vote, what you're doing is you're giving your voice to someone else. And that other someone else may not necessarily have your best interest at heart. So it is important that people understand that they must get involved, right? To me, it's not an option, right? If you are unhappy with what's going on, then you have to get involved. And that means, getting to know your elected officials, reading, informing yourself when you're going to vote, and then obviously the more time that you have, if you can, work on helping, legislation pass, then you do that. But at the very least, just sort of the floor, the bottom line, make sure that you understand who is representing you, what they stand for, how do they vote, and when you do go out to vote, make sure that you're voting for people that hopefully represent your needs and your desires. I tell people, and this sounds a little crass, but I'll say it here, and again, not my saying, I heard that from someone else, but if you're not at the table, you are on the table. Meaning if you're not sitting and playing a role in how things are decided, then somebody else has you on the dish and they're dealing with you however they want to.
That makes sense to me. I know it couldn't get any plainer than that.
Trying to.
One last little snippet. When can we get you back down there in the hub and the dub? When can we get you back down there in Compton and Watts?
You know what? Talk to Tiffany and we'll figure it out.
Tiffany.
Calendar is tough, but we'll try to make a time.
I really, really appreciate this. I know that you're busy. We got to get busy back to work.
Yep.
Any send something to the kids out there.
Look, I know that sometimes it's very, very hard. And I know that sometimes you may think nobody cares for you. And look, this is where I do have an experience. Okay, you're looking at a former high school dropout. Okay, I grew up in conditions probably very similar to the conditions that many of you grew up. Most of the kids that I grew up with wound up in other places that thankfully I'm not. Don't give up on yourself. If the neighborhood is not the place that is doing it for you, look for a way out. Believe in yourself and fight for what you believe.
That's it right there. It's a wrap.
Right. Good deal. It's a real pleasure.
I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We will be seeing each other again.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good deal. You got
Indeed.
it. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Sir, Didontae wanted a...
Oh, yeah, I want your autograph.
Okay.
A podcast called Strangest Fruit.